Look at this, a big black guy pretending to be some kind of war hero inside a VA hospital. Officer Travis Monroe sneered as he yanked the faded military backpack from Marcus Ellison's shoulder and slammed the 48-year-old black veteran face first onto the polished lobby floor. Prescription papers, a worn bronze star medal, and an old military photograph scattered across the tiles as stunned veterans watched in disbelief. Monroe drove his knee harder into Marcus's back and laughed. "Anybody can buy surplus army gear online. You expect me to believe a black man dressed like this earned medals instead of making excuses?" His partner smirked, while several people nervously backed away. Monroe kicked the bronze medal across the floor with the tip of his boot. "Maybe this belongs in a pawn shop. That's probably the only place it's worth anything." The laughter around him grew louder. Then Monroe leaned closer and tightened the handcuffs until Marcus winced. "You're not a hero. You're just another problem wasting taxpayers' money. Stay down where you belong." Across the lobby, 76-year-old Henry Wallace struggled to stand from his wheelchair. "Please, he saved my life," Henry cried. Nobody listened. Phones rose to record what looked like another public humiliation. Then the deep rumble of several engines echoed outside. One black SUV stopped, then another, then another. Within moments, silent men with unmistakable military bearing stepped through the entrance, their eyes fixed on the handcuffed veteran beneath Officer Monroe's knee. Before this story unfolds, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is. If you believe true courage deserves respect and justice should never depend on appearances, subscribe and stay with us until the very end. Isa, good to see you. I've learned that people may forget where you came from, but they remember how carefully you listened. Only 20 minutes earlier, the morning had looked completely ordinary. The July sun had barely climbed above the Houston skyline when Marcus Ellison eased his aging pickup truck into the crowded parking lot of the VA Medical Center. The faded blue truck had nearly 200,000 miles on it, and every dent told a story Marcus never bothered to explain. He shut off the engine, looked toward the entrance, and smiled gently at the elderly man sitting beside him. "You ready, Henry?" 76-year-old Henry Wallace managed a weak grin. His hands trembled as they rested on his cane. "I've been through firefights with less anxiety than these appointments." Marcus chuckled softly. "That's why I'm here." For nearly 4 years, Marcus had driven Henry to every VA appointment without accepting a single dollar. Henry's daughter Lisa had offered countless times to pay for gas, but Marcus always refused. "You covered my 6 when nobody else could," he often reminded Henry. Henry would always shake his head. "No, son, we covered each other." No one at the VA knew the full story. They only saw a quiet black man in worn jeans, old work boots, and a faded military jacket helping an elderly veteran into a wheelchair every few weeks. Most assumed Marcus was simply a volunteer. Few even looked twice. Inside the hospital lobby, the familiar smell of disinfectant mixed with fresh coffee drifting from a small cafe near the entrance. Veterans chatted quietly while nurses called names over the speakers. Everything felt peaceful. Marcus pushed Henry toward the reception desk. "You wait here," he said. "I'll check us in." Receptionist Megan Foster smiled politely. "Morning, Marcus." "Morning." She already knew him by name. Marcus had spent years helping older veterans complete paperwork, find transportation, and understand confusing benefits forms. Whenever someone became frustrated, he patiently sat beside them until every page was finished. Many employees appreciated him. A few even wondered why such a humble man spent so much time helping strangers. Marcus never answered. Helping veterans simply felt like unfinished duty. As Megan searched Henry's appointment record, Henry's breathing suddenly changed. His fingers gripped the armrests. His eyes darted around the crowded lobby. No. Marcus immediately recognized the signs. Not a heart attack, a flashback. Henry had suffered severe combat-related PTSD since Afghanistan. The crowded room, the loud announcements, the echoing footsteps. Sometimes they pulled him back into memories he desperately wanted to escape. Marcus knelt beside him. Henry. No response. Henry, stay with me. The old veteran's breathing became rapid. Sweat formed across his forehead. I hear helicopters? Henry whispered. There aren't any helicopters. I hear gunfire. Marcus calmly placed one hand on Henry's shoulder. Look at me. Nothing. Marcus lowered his own voice. Count with me. Me. Still nothing. Nearby patients began watching. Some looked concerned. Others simply stared. Marcus turned toward the reception desk. Megan, can you call Nurse Olivia? Henry's having another PTSD episode? I'm trying. Before she could finish dialing, Henry suddenly lurched forward, trying to stand. No! He shouted. They're still out there. The wheelchair tipped sideways. Marcus instinctively caught him before his head struck the tile floor. At that exact moment, Officer Travis Monroe entered the lobby with Officer Kevin Morales during their routine security patrol. From across the room, Monroe saw only fragments. A large black man grabbing an elderly patient. A wheelchair overturned, people shouting. Without asking a single question, he reacted. There! Monroe pointed. Get him! Marcus heard heavy footsteps racing toward him. He looked over one shoulder. Officer, wait! Monroe never let him finish. He slammed into Marcus with both hands, driving him away from Henry before forcing him chest first against a nearby information counter. What are you doing? Marcus shouted. Hands behind your back. The veteran needs help. I said hands behind your back. Marcus slowly raised both palms. I'm not fighting you. Henry tried to stand again. No. He reached toward Marcus. Leave him alone. Officer Morales moved to restrain Henry's wheelchair while several visitors hurried away from the commotion. Nurse Olivia Bennett burst from the nearby hallway. What's happening? Marcus looked directly at her. Henry's PTSD. But Monroe interpreted Marcus turning his head as resistance. With one violent shove, he threw Marcus onto the polished floor. The impact echoed through the entire lobby. Gasps filled the room. Marcus's cheek struck the tile. He made no attempt to fight back. He simply stretched both arms away from his body. I'm complying. Monroe jerked Marcus's wrists behind his back. Too late. Metal handcuffs snapped shut. The old military backpack slid across the floor. Its zipper burst open. Prescription bottles rolled away. Medical paperwork scattered beneath dozens of feet. An old unit photograph fluttered across the lobby before landing beside a waiting veteran. The worn bronze star medal spun twice before stopping near Monroe's boot. Without hesitation, Monroe nudged it away with the toe of his shoe. Cheap souvenirs don't impress me. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment. Not because his wrists hurt, not because people were staring, but because Henry was still struggling to breathe. Please, Marcus said quietly. Forget about me. Help Henry. For the first time, several veterans exchanged uneasy glances. Something about Marcus's voice didn't sound like a criminal begging for himself. It sounded like a soldier worrying about someone else while lying in handcuffs. Across the lobby, Henry finally found enough strength to shout through trembling breaths. He's the reason I'm still alive." His words hung in the silent lobby. Officer Monroe ignored them completely. Outside the hospital entrance, the distant rumble of powerful engines slowly began rolling across the parking lot. No one inside had noticed them yet. The lobby fell into an uneasy silence. Marcus Ellison remained motionless on the polished floor, his wrists secured behind his back. His breathing was steady, despite the sharp pain shooting through his shoulders. Years of military discipline had taught him that panic only made a bad situation worse. Officer Travis Monroe, however, interpreted Marcus's composure as arrogance. "You've got a lot of confidence for a man in handcuffs," Monroe sneered as he tightened his grip on Marcus's arm. "Maybe jail will teach you some respect." Marcus slowly turned his head just enough to speak without struggling. "I'm asking one last time." His voice remained calm. "Please help Mr. Wallace." Monroe laughed. "Still pretending you're worried about somebody else?" Henry Wallace slammed both trembling hands against the arms of his wheelchair. "He isn't pretending." His cracked voice echoed through the lobby. "He brought me here. I almost fell because of my PTSD." Several veterans looked at one another. The story they had witnessed no longer matched what Officer Monroe was saying. Officer Kevin Morales shifted uneasily. "Travis." Monroe didn't even glance at him. "I saw him grabbing the old man." "You saw the last 2 seconds," Morales answered quietly. "What?" I'm just saying we don't know what happened before we got here." Monroe shot him a warning look. "I know exactly what I saw." Marcus closed his eyes. This wasn't the first time someone had judged him before hearing a single word. But what hurt wasn't the humiliation. It was watching Henry's breathing become more erratic with every passing second. Nurse Olivia Bennett knelt beside Henry, checking his pulse. "Henry, look at me." His hands continued shaking uncontrollably. "I hear explosions." "There aren't any." "They're coming." Olivia looked toward Marcus, then back at Monroe. "Officer, he's telling the truth." Monroe folded his arms. "About what?" "He has severe combat-related PTSD. So, the gentleman on the floor has brought him here dozens of times." Monroe shrugged. "Doesn't change what I witnessed." "It changes everything if he was trying to stop Henry from falling." Before Olivia could answer, receptionist Megan Foster stepped forward. "I saw part of it." Monroe turned. "You did. Marcus asked me to call medical staff before anything happened. He could have been creating a distraction." Megan stared at him in disbelief. "Marcus has been helping veterans here for years. And he volunteers, so he never causes trouble." Monroe crossed his arms even tighter. "Good people commit crimes every day." The statement sucked the remaining warmth from the room. A retired Marine sitting near the coffee stand slowly stood. His name tag identified him as Frank Collins. "I've seen that young man in here." He pointed toward Marcus. "He carried my walker to the parking lot last winter." Another veteran spoke. "He helped me fill out disability paperwork." "So did me." "He drove my neighbor home after surgery." Voices began rising from every corner of the waiting room. "He helped my brother. He bought lunch for my husband. He stayed 3 hours with a confused veteran who couldn't remember his address." Officer Monroe raised both hands. "Enough." The room fell silent again. "I'm not interested in popularity contests." Marcus finally spoke again. I'm not asking anyone to defend me. Everyone turned toward him. I'm asking someone. He swallowed, to take Henry to his appointment. Henry's eyes filled with tears. Even now. Even lying handcuffed on the floor, Marcus was thinking about someone else. Nurse Olivia looked at Monroe. I'm taking him. Monroe didn't object. She wheeled Henry toward the emergency treatment hallway. Before disappearing through the doors, Henry looked back over his shoulder. His voice cracked. Don't leave him. Marcus managed a faint smile. I'll be okay. Henry disappeared. The lobby felt strangely empty. Officer Monroe crouched beside Marcus and picked up the old military photograph lying on the floor. 6 young soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in a dusty desert landscape. Their uniforms were stained, their faces exhausted. Monroe turned the picture over. Written in faded ink were the words, "We came home because he refused to leave us." Monroe smirked. Nice little souvenir. He tossed it onto Marcus's back. You veterans love dramatic stories. Marcus said nothing. Nearby, Frank Collins quietly bent down and picked up the Bronze Star Medal. He wiped dust from its surface with his sleeve. The ribbon was badly faded. The medal itself had scratches earned through decades of handling. This isn't fake, Frank whispered. Monroe looked over. You some kind of medal expert? Frank nodded slowly. I earned one. Silence. Another elderly veteran stepped closer. So did I. A third voice followed. So did my brother. Without realizing it, Monroe had kicked one of the most respected military decorations across the hospital floor. Several veterans watched him with growing anger. Officer Morales leaned toward his partner. I think we should slow this down. Monroe shook his head. If we back off now, he'll think he can manipulate us. Morales lowered his voice even further. No. He glanced around the room. I think we're losing the room. Monroe finally looked around. Dozens of eyes stared back at him. Not with fear, not with admiration, with disappointment. Phones were still recording. Jennifer Ross, a local freelance reporter who had been interviewing veterans about healthcare access, lowered her camera for a moment. Then she pressed record again. This is all live, she murmured. Across social media, the first clips began spreading. A caption appeared above one video. Black veteran pinned face down inside Houston, VA. Within minutes, thousands of people had already shared it. Miles away, retired Colonel Jonathan Briggs was drinking coffee on his porch when his phone vibrated. He glanced down. One of his former Delta teammates had sent only a single message. Tell me I'm seeing this wrong. Attached was the video. Jonathan tapped play. He watched silently for nearly 30 seconds. Then he froze, not because of the officer, not because of the handcuffs, but because he recognized the man lying on the floor before anyone spoke his name. Jonathan slowly stood. His coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered across the porch. No. He whispered the word to himself. Then he reached for another phone. 1 call became 3. 3 became 7. Within minutes, phones were ringing across Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and beyond. No speeches were needed, only one sentence. Marcus needs us. Inside the VA Medical Center, Officer Monroe still believed he had complete control. He had no idea that hundreds of miles away, men who had once followed Marcus into the deadliest missions of their lives were already getting into their vehicles, and every one of them was heading toward Houston. Officer Travis Monroe pulled Marcus Ellison to his feet with a sharp jerk on the handcuffs. "You're coming with me." Marcus stumbled only half a step before regaining his balance. He neither protested nor resisted. "I'm walking," he said quietly. "Then keep walking." Dozens of veterans silently watched as Monroe escorted Marcus toward the VA security office. The hallway that normally echoed with casual conversations now felt heavy with disbelief. Some lowered their heads in disappointment. Others continued recording every second. Officer Kevin Morales followed several steps behind, glancing repeatedly at the growing crowd. Something about this situation no longer felt right. Inside the small security office, Monroe pushed Marcus into a metal chair. "Sit." Marcus complied. The handcuffs remained locked behind his back. Monroe tossed the worn military backpack onto the desk. Prescription bottles rolled across the surface before stopping against an old computer monitor. "Let's see what you've been hiding," Kevin frowned. "Shouldn't we inventory his property first?" Monroe ignored him. He unzipped every compartment. Work gloves, a flashlight, a folding reading glass, a small first aid kit. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal. Finally, Monroe found a weathered leather wallet. Inside were an old driver's license, a VA identification card, several faded family photographs, and a folded picture no larger than a postcard. Marcus looked up for the first time. "Please don't bend that photograph." Monroe unfolded it anyway. The picture showed 6 exhausted soldiers sitting beside a damaged helicopter somewhere in the desert. Every man was covered in dust. The tallest soldier sat quietly at the edge of the group. Marcus. Across the bottom, handwritten in black ink, were the words, "To the man who carried us home. Brothers forever." Monroe laughed. "Well, looks like somebody enjoys writing fan mail to himself." Marcus remained silent. Kevin looked more closely. The signatures underneath were genuine, written in different handwriting. Before he could speak, Monroe tossed the photograph carelessly back onto the desk. "You know what's funny?" Marcus met his eyes. "No. Guys who really do something important never have to tell everyone about it." Marcus answered with complete calm. "I never did." The room became quiet. Monroe searched another pocket. He pulled out a small notebook filled with handwritten names and appointment dates. Kevin picked it up. "What is this?" Marcus answered. "Veterans who asked me for rides." Kevin slowly turned the pages. Every line contained a different name. Hospital appointments, dialysis sessions, physical therapy, cancer treatment. Next to several names, Marcus had written simple reminders. Bring blanket. Hearing aid batteries. No stairs. Needs wheelchair. Kevin looked at Marcus again. "So you drive all these people when I can. You charge them?" "No." "Why?" Marcus just shrugged slightly. "They shouldn't have to choose between buying gas and seeing a doctor." Kevin quietly closed the notebook. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Monroe's radio crackled. "Unit 7 be advised. Multiple calls regarding the VA incident. Media beginning to gather outside." Monroe grabbed the radio. "Copy." Another voice followed almost immediately. "The chief wants an update," Monroe answered confidently. "Male suspect secured. Situation under control." Marcus lowered his eyes. He didn't care about reporters. He cared about Henry. "Officer." Monroe looked over. "What now?" "Has anyone checked whether Henry received his medication?" Monroe rolled his eyes. "You're still worried about him?" "Yes." "You should worry about yourself." Marcus leaned back against the chair. "I already know how my day is going." Monroe stared at him. Marcus wasn't angry. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't even trying to defend himself. His concern had never changed. Henry came first. Across the hallway, Nurse Olivia Bennett stepped out of the treatment room after stabilizing Henry Wallace. Henry had finally stopped shaking, but tears continued rolling down his weathered face. "Where's Marcus?" he asked weakly. Olivia hesitated. "They're still questioning him." Henry struggled to sit upright. "He didn't do anything." "I know. You've got to tell them." "I already tried." Henry closed his eyes. His voice became little more than a whisper. 30 years ago. Olivia leaned closer. "He carried me nearly 2 miles after I was hit." She blinked. "What?" "He could have left me." Henry swallowed painfully. "Instead, he came back." Olivia had heard countless stories from veterans over the years. Most became a little larger each time they were told. But the way Henry spoke, there was no exaggeration. Only gratitude. Back inside the security office, Kevin's phone vibrated. His wife had texted him a link. "Isn't this your hospital?" He opened it. The video had already reached hundreds of thousands of views. Comments poured in faster than he could read. That officer never asked a single question. Leave that veteran alone. Find out who that man is. This is disgraceful. Kevin slowly locked his phone. "Travis." "What?" "This thing is blowing up." Monroe scoffed. "So what? So maybe we should review the surveillance footage before filing charges." Monroe shook his head. "I don't need a video." "You always tell rookies evidence comes first." "I have evidence." "You have assumptions." For the first, Monroe's expression hardened. "You questioning my judgment." Kevin held his gaze. "I'm questioning whether we're making a mistake." Before Monroe could answer, someone knocked firmly on the office door. Alan Pierce, the VA security supervisor, stepped inside. His normally calm face carried obvious concern. "There are television crews outside." Monroe shrugged. "They'll leave." Alan didn't. "The hospital director wants this handled carefully." "It is being handled." Alan looked at Marcus. The black veteran sat quietly in the chair, wrists still cuffed behind his back, saying nothing. No threats, no shouting, no anger, just patience. Alan turned back toward Monroe. "Maybe it's time we slow down." Before Monroe could respond, another security officer hurried down the hallway. "Supervisor." Alan stepped outside. "What is it?" The officer lowered his voice, but everyone inside could still hear him. "You need to come outside." "Why?" "There are 7 black SUVs parked in front of the main entrance." Alan frowned. "So?" The young officer swallowed. "They're all military, and more are still arriving." The hallway suddenly fell silent. Marcus slowly lifted his head for the first time since entering the room. He said nothing. But somewhere deep inside, he knew exactly who had come. Outside the Houston VA Medical Center, the morning traffic slowed almost to a crawl. Veterans arriving for appointments stopped in the parking lot, confused by the growing line of black SUVs parked neatly along the curb. None of the vehicles displayed emergency lights or military markings. They looked ordinary except for the men stepping out of them. Each carried himself with quiet discipline. No one shouted. No one hurried. Yet every movement carried the unmistakable confidence of someone who had spent years operating under pressure. Inside the security office, Alan Pierce stared through the front windows. "They're still coming," he whispered. Officer Travis Monroe folded his arms. So what veterans visit the VA every day? The young security officer shook his head. Not like these. Allen looked closer. Every newcomer paused before entering the building. Some wore business suits. Others wore jeans and polo shirts. One walked with a slight limp. Another had gray hair and a prosthetic leg. Despite their different appearances, they all shared the same calm expression. More importantly, every one of them looked toward the security office before saying a single word. Kevin Morales quietly stepped beside Allen. Do you know who they are? Allen slowly shook his head. No. Back inside the room, Marcus remained seated exactly as before. His wrists were still cuffed. His shoulders ached. The cut above his eyebrow had dried into a thin line of blood, yet his expression never changed. Officer Monroe noticed. You're awfully calm. Marcus looked up. Panicking won't help anyone. Monroe smirked. Maybe you've been arrested before. Marcus answered without emotion. No. Then today must be your lucky day. Kevin looked away. The joke no longer felt funny. Meanwhile, in the emergency treatment room, Henry Wallace had regained enough strength to sit upright. Nurse Olivia Bennett adjusted his blanket. Your breathing is much better. Henry nodded weakly. I need to see Marcus. You should rest. I've rested enough. He reached into the pocket of his old jacket with trembling fingers. Olivia watched as he removed a faded leather key holder. Inside was a small photograph. It showed two young soldiers standing beside a military helicopter. One of them was Henry, the other, Marcus. Henry smiled sadly. He was only 26. Olivia examined the picture. So were you. Henry nodded. We were both scared. He traced Marcus's younger face with one finger. Nobody knows what that man has carried. What do you mean? Henry looked toward the ceiling. There were 6 of us. Olivia frowned. 6. Henry closed his eyes. 5 came home because Marcus refused to leave the 6th behind. Before Olivia could ask another question, Henry gently folded the photograph and slipped it back into his pocket. I promised him. What? I'd never tell the whole story. Back in the lobby, television vans had begun arriving. Reporter Rachel Kim stepped out carrying a microphone while her cameraman Brian Cooper prepared equipment. Neither had expected a national story that morning. What do we know? Brian asked. Rachel glanced at her phone. The video has already passed 2 million views. What? In less than an hour. Brian looked toward the entrance. Who is the veteran? Rachel shook her head. Nobody seems to know. She frowned. That's the strange part. What? There isn't a single negative thing anyone has said about him. Every interview produced the same answer. He helped me. He drove me. He stayed with my husband. He bought groceries. He fixed my wheelchair. He never asked for anything. Rachel lowered her notebook. In 20 years of reporting. She looked toward the building. I've never seen a suspect defended like this. Inside the security office, Allen's phone suddenly rang. The caller ID displayed David Brooks, hospital director. Allen answered immediately. Sir, what is happening down there? We're still investigating. I've got officials calling my office. So do we. David's voice grew serious. Release nothing until we review every camera angle. Officer Monroe overheard the conversation. We already know what happened. Alan covered the phone. No. He glanced toward Marcus. We think we know. The call ended. Monroe looked irritated. Everybody's acting like this guy's some kind of celebrity. Marcus quietly interrupted. I'm not. Monroe laughed. Finally, something we agree on. Marcus didn't respond. He simply lowered his eyes again. Kevin couldn't stop watching him. Most innocent people eventually became angry. Some shouted. Others demanded lawyers. Marcus did neither. He had asked only one question since being detained. Has Henry received his medication? Nothing else. Kevin finally spoke. Marcus. Marcus looked up. What branch? The Army. What unit? Marcus hesitated only briefly. I served where I was assigned. Monroe laughed loudly. That's a convenient answer. Marcus remained silent. Kevin noticed something unusual. Marcus had answered the first question, but not the second, almost as though he legally couldn't. Outside, another SUV rolled quietly into the parking lot. This one stopped closest to the entrance. A tall man in his mid-50s stepped out wearing a simple navy blazer. No insignia, no medals, no uniform. Just polished shoes and the posture of someone who had spent decades leading soldiers. He paused beside the vehicle, looked toward the VA entrance, then removed his sunglasses. One of the younger security guards whispered to Alan, "Who's that?" Alan shook his head. I don't know. But Marcus knew. Even from nearly 100 feet away, Colonel Jonathan Briggs, his former commanding officer. The man Marcus hadn't seen in almost 11 years. Jonathan slowly climbed the entrance steps. Another former operator joined him, then another. Without exchanging a word, they entered the lobby together. Veterans instinctively stepped aside, not because anyone ordered them to, because something about those men demanded quiet respect. Rachel Kim noticed immediately. Brian. What? Get the camera on them. Who are they? I don't know. She kept filming. But whatever this story really is, her instincts told her everything was about to change. Jonathan stopped at the reception desk. His voice remained calm. I'm looking for Marcus Ellison. Receptionist Megan Foster hesitated. They're holding him in security. Jonathan nodded once. I figured. He thanked her politely, then turned toward the hallway. Behind him, more than a dozen former Delta operators fell silently into step. No commands were given. No introductions were needed. They simply walked together. Every employee they passed instinctively moved aside. The closer they came to the security office, the quieter the hospital became. Inside, Officer Monroe finally noticed the unusual silence outside the door. He frowned. What now? Before anyone answered. There came 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the security office door. Not loud, not aggressive, just confident. Marcus lifted his eyes, for the first time that morning. He smiled. The room froze. 3 calm knocks had silenced an entire hallway. Officer Travis Monroe exchanged a puzzled glance with Kevin Morales before raising his voice. Come in. The door opened slowly. A tall man with silver hair and a calm expression stepped inside, followed by several other men who carried themselves with unmistakable military discipline. None wore uniforms. None displayed rank or medals, yet their posture alone commanded respect. The man in front stopped just inside the doorway. Good morning. His voice was measured. My name is Jonathan Briggs. Monroe remained seated. So, I'm here to see Marcus Ellison. Monroe folded his arms. He's being detained. Jonathan nodded as though he had expected that answer. I know. You family? No. Attorney? No. Then this conversation is over. Jonathan didn't move. Instead, he looked past Monroe toward the handcuffed man sitting quietly in the metal chair. Marcus slowly stood. For the first time that morning, emotion crossed his face. Colonel. Jonathan smiled faintly. It's been too long. Marcus nodded once. Yes, sir. Kevin's eyes widened. Colonel Officer Monroe noticed the exchange but refused to acknowledge it. You know this guy? Jonathan looked back at him. I've known him for over 20 years. That doesn't change anything. No, Jonathan agreed calmly. It simply means I know exactly what kind of man you're holding. The room fell silent again. Monroe leaned back. If you're here to pressure us, it's not going to work. Jonathan smiled politely. I'm not here to pressure anyone. Good. I'm here because one of my former soldiers called me. Monroe shrugged. So? Jonathan's expression became more serious. He sent me a 30-second video. Kevin instinctively looked down. Jonathan continued. I watched it 5 times, and I recognized Marcus before anyone spoke his name. Monroe laughed. So he's famous among old army buddies. One of the men standing behind Jonathan finally spoke. No. His voice was quiet but firm. He's the reason my daughter grew up with a father. The room became still. Another man stepped forward. My son graduated college because Marcus carried me out of a valley after I was shot. A third spoke without raising his voice. My wife got 23 more anniversaries because he refused to leave me behind. No one sounded dramatic. No one exaggerated. They simply stated facts. Monroe looked from one face to another. Who exactly are you people? Jonathan answered. Men who served with Marcus. Kevin noticed something remarkable. Every one of them stood with the same respectful distance behind Marcus. Not beside him, not in front of him, behind him, as if acknowledging that he had once led them through something none of them would ever forget. Monroe shook his head. Stories don't erase evidence. Jonathan nodded. I agree. Then we're done. No, Jonathan replied. We're just getting started. At that moment, Alan Pierce hurried into the room carrying a tablet. We've got the first security footage. Monroe reached for it immediately. Perfect. The video began playing. Everyone watched silently. The overhead camera showed Henry Wallace beginning to panic inside the lobby. Marcus immediately knelt beside him. He never grabbed Henry violently. He never threatened him. Instead, he caught Henry only after the elderly veteran lost his balance and the wheelchair tipped sideways. Seconds later, Officer Monroe entered the frame at a run, without speaking, without asking a question, without waiting for medical staff. He shoved Marcus away from Henry. The recording continued. Marcus raised both empty hands before any physical struggle occurred. Then Monroe forced him to the floor. The room remained silent until the video ended. Kevin slowly exhaled. So, no one answered. Jonathan simply looked at Monroe. I believe you mentioned evidence. Monroe's face tightened. He still interfered with police activity. Kevin couldn't stay silent anymore. No, he spoke carefully. He was trying to protect Mr. Wallace. Monroe turned sharply. You're taking his side. I'm taking the video's side. Allen looked equally uncomfortable. The footage doesn't support an assault. Monroe's jaw clenched. Before he could respond, another knock came at the door. Hospital Director David Brooks entered, followed by Captain Thomas Reed from Internal Affairs. David's expression was tense. Officer Monroe. Monroe stood. Sir. David glanced around the room. I've just reviewed the footage. He paused. So has the VA legal department. Captain Reed spoke next. Until this investigation is complete, no charges will be filed. Monroe stared at him. What? You heard me. I acted in good faith. Perhaps. Reed's tone remained professional. But good faith still requires reasonable judgment. Monroe looked toward Marcus. For the first time all morning, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Jonathan quietly stepped beside Marcus. He still made no demand, no threat, no accusation. He simply asked one question. How's Henry? Marcus answered immediately. Is he okay? Jonathan smiled. First thing you ask. Marcus looked down. He needed his medication. Jonathan placed one hand gently on Marcus's shoulder. Henry's stable. Marcus finally released the breath he had been holding for nearly an hour. Outside the security office, more former Delta operators continued arriving. Veterans throughout the lobby began whispering to one another. Nobody knew exactly who Marcus Ellison had been. But everyone was beginning to understand one thing. The quiet black veteran sitting in handcuffs was far more than an ordinary former soldier, and the greatest truth about him had not yet been spoken. For nearly 30 seconds, no one spoke. The security office, once filled with Officer Travis Monroe's confidence, now felt unbearably small. Captain Thomas Reed from Internal Affairs replayed the surveillance footage one more time. The outcome did not change. Marcus Ellison had never attacked Henry Wallace. He had caught an elderly veteran who was falling. Then he had been tackled before he could explain. Reed locked the tablet and looked directly at Monroe. The evidence is clear. Monroe refused to lower his eyes. I made a split-second decision. You made one without asking a single question. I believed someone was in danger. There was someone in danger. Reed paused. It just wasn't the man you thought. Monroe's jaw tightened. So what now? David Brooks, the hospital director, answered before Reed could. Right now, we de-escalate. Monroe shook his head immediately. No. Every face in the room turned towards him. I'm not releasing him. Kevin Morales stared at his partner. What? He interfered with an active police response. Kevin frowned. There wasn't an active police response until you created one. Monroe ignored him. He refused verbal commands. Marcus finally spoke. I asked you to help Henry. Exactly. Monroe pointed at him. You kept talking after I gave commands. Jonathan Briggs couldn't help but let out a quiet sigh. This isn't about officer safety anymore. Monroe folded his arms. No. It's about accountability. Jonathan looked at him calmly. No. It's about pride. Those 4 words landed harder than anyone expected. Monroe's face reddened. You don't know me. Jonathan answered without raising his voice. I know men. He glanced toward Marcus. And I know the difference between someone who seeks control and someone who accepts responsibility. Silence settled over the room once again. Outside the office, more veterans had gathered. Word had spread through every hallway that the black veteran being detained was surrounded by former special operations soldiers. No one knew his story, but curiosity had replaced judgment. Inside the treatment area, Henry Wallace insisted on leaving his hospital bed. Nurse Olivia Bennett tried to stop him. "You should stay here." "I can't. You need another 30 minutes of observation." Henry slowly swung his legs over the side of the bed. Marcus would never leave me. His breathing was still uneven. "So I'm not leaving him." Olivia finally nodded. "I'll go with you." Several minutes later, Henry's wheelchair rolled slowly toward the security office. Veterans quietly stepped aside as he passed. Some placed gentle hands on his shoulder. Others simply nodded. Henry reached the open doorway just as another black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Then another. Then another. By now, nearly 30 former Delta operators stood quietly throughout the lobby. None had spoken to reporters. None had challenged police. None had raised their voices. They simply waited. Rachel Kim lowered her microphone. "This doesn't make sense." Brian Cooper adjusted the camera lens. "What doesn't?" "I've covered military reunions." "So have I." "I've never seen this." "What do you mean?" Rachel watched another gray-haired veteran enter the building carrying a simple cane. "He flew here from somewhere." "How do you know?" "The airport luggage tag is still attached to his bag." Brian zoomed in. Another man arrived wearing civilian clothes with an oxygen tube beneath his nose. A third walked with the assistance of a prosthetic leg. Some were clearly in pain. Some had traveled overnight. Yet every one of them came for the same reason. Not publicity, not politics. Marcus. Back inside the security office, Captain Reed unlocked Marcus's handcuffs. The metallic click echoed across the room. Marcus slowly rubbed his wrists. He did not complain. He did not glare at Monroe. Instead, he quietly asked, "May I check on Henry now?" Jonathan smiled to himself, even after everything. That was still Marcus's first concern. Before anyone answered, Henry's voice came from the hallway. "I'm right here." Marcus immediately turned. "Henry!" The elderly veteran rolled into the room. The moment their eyes met, Henry's shoulders relaxed. "You all right?" Marcus nodded. I've had worse mornings." A few quiet chuckles broke the tension. Henry reached out. Marcus gently took his hand. "I'm sorry." Marcus frowned. "For what? You came here to help me." Henry swallowed. "And I couldn't even protect you." Marcus squeezed his hand. "You already did." Henry looked confused. "You reminded me why I came." Those standing nearby exchanged silent glances. Neither man spoke like a victim. Neither blamed the other. The bond between them had clearly been forged somewhere no one else in the room could fully understand. Officer Monroe watched the exchange with growing frustration. Everything around him was slipping away. The evidence, the witnesses, public opinion. Even Kevin now stood several feet farther away from him than before. Monroe suddenly took a step forward. "I'm still not convinced." Captain Reed looked at him. "About what?" "We still don't know who he really is." Jonathan answered calmly. "No, you don't." Monroe pointed toward Marcus. Everyone keeps acting like he's some legend." "No one has said that." "Then why are all of you here?" No one answered immediately. Jonathan slowly looked around the room, then toward the hallway, then back at Monroe. Because loyalty isn't something we retire from. He paused. You asked who Marcus really is. Jonathan reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. Every eye followed the movement. He carefully removed a worn leather credential holder. Not a weapon. Not a threat. Just an old identification wallet. He held it in his hand for several seconds before looking at Marcus. Marcus gave the smallest shake of his head, almost pleading. Jonathan understood immediately. After all these years, Marcus still didn't want recognition. Jonathan smiled sadly. You haven't changed. Marcus quietly replied, I never needed people to know. Jonathan nodded. I know. He slipped the credential holder back into his pocket without opening it. Monroe frowned. What was that supposed to prove? Jonathan met his eyes. Only one thing. What? When the truth comes out. He glanced toward the dozens of former operators filling the hallway. It won't be because Marcus wanted attention. The room became silent once more. At that exact moment, another vehicle stopped outside. Unlike the others, this one carried official government plates. Captain Reed looked through the window. His expression changed instantly. David Brooks followed his gaze. What is it? Reed answered quietly. I believe. He took a slow breath. Washington just arrived. Every conversation in the hallway stopped. Whatever secret Marcus Ellison had spent decades hiding was no longer something that could remain buried. Every conversation inside the VA Medical Center faded into silence. The government sedan rolled to a smooth stop beneath the front entrance canopy. A man in a dark suit stepped out first, followed by a woman wearing the insignia of a United States Army colonel. Behind them walked two uniformed military police officers, not with urgency, but with quiet professionalism. Captain Thomas Reed narrowed his eyes. I know that officer. Hospital Director David Brooks looked at him. Who is she? Colonel Rebecca Lawson. Reed swallowed. Special Operations Command. Officer Travis Monroe felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What would Special Operations Command be doing here, Juan Puchil? No one answered. Colonel Rebecca Lawson entered the lobby with measured steps. The crowd instinctively moved aside. She acknowledged no cameras, ignored every reporter, and walked directly toward Jonathan Briggs. The two exchanged a brief handshake. Jonathan, Colonel, you got here before I did. I live closer. She nodded, then looked past him toward the security office. Is Marcus inside? Jonathan answered quietly. He's waiting. Without another word, Rebecca walked through the hallway. The dozens of former Delta operators standing along the corridor straightened almost instinctively. Some nodded. Others simply stood a little taller. None saluted. This wasn't an official ceremony. It was respect. Rebecca entered the security office and stopped 3 feet from Marcus. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, to everyone's surprise, the colonel extended her hand. Master Sergeant Marcus Ellison. Marcus looked almost uncomfortable. You don't have to do that. I do. He slowly accepted the handshake. It has been a long time. It has. Officer Monroe interrupted. Excuse me. Rebecca turned toward him. Yes. Who exactly is this man? Rebecca studied Monroe for a moment before answering. A soldier. I can see that. A soldier whose service record remains classified. The room fell completely silent. Monroe frowned. Classified? Yes. So what was he? Rebecca smiled faintly. I'm not authorized to discuss operational details. Monroe folded his arms. Convenient. Jonathan Briggs stepped beside her. Officer, you're asking the wrong question. What's the right one? Jonathan looked directly into his eyes. You should be asking why dozens of retired Delta operators crossed state lines on almost no notice. No one in the room moved. Jonathan slowly turned toward the men waiting in the hallway. There were 23 of us. Marcus lowered his eyes. Jonathan continued. Different years. Different deployments. Different teams. But every single one of us owes this man a debt. One by one, the former operators stepped forward until they formed a quiet line behind Marcus. No speeches, no dramatic gestures, just silent presence. Rachel Kim stood at the hallway entrance, microphone lowered. Even Brian Cooper forgot to adjust the camera. Neither wanted to interrupt what they were witnessing. Jonathan spoke first. I was a company commander. He glanced at Marcus. One mission went bad. He looked back at the room. We lost communications. He paused. I gave the order to withdraw. Marcus closed his eyes. Jonathan's voice softened. He refused. Officer Monroe frowned. He disobeyed an order. Jonathan nodded. He did. The room seemed to freeze. He walked back into enemy territory alone. No one breathed. He returned carrying the first wounded soldier. Jonathan looked toward the men behind Marcus. Then he went back. A second veteran spoke quietly. He carried me out. Another stepped forward. He went back again. A third man smiled sadly. I was number 3. The next veteran nodded. I was number 4. The man with the prosthetic leg raised his hand. I was number 5. Finally, Henry Wallace slowly rolled his wheelchair beside Marcus. His eyes filled with tears. I was the last one. The entire hallway fell silent. Jonathan looked toward Officer Monroe. You asked why we're here. He gently placed one hand on Marcus's shoulder. Because every one of us is alive today for the same reason. He paused. Marcus refused to leave anyone behind. No applause followed, no cheering, only silence. The weight of those words settled over every person in the building. Officer Kevin Morales slowly removed his police cap. Without saying a word, he held it against his chest. Several veterans nearby instinctively did the same. Hospital Director David Brooks felt his throat tighten. Rachel Kim quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye before whispering to Brian, "Keep recording." Brian nodded silently. Officer Monroe stared at Marcus. The image before him no longer matched the man he had forced onto the floor. He remembered kicking the bronze star across the lobby, calling it worthless, calling Marcus a fraud. The memory now burned with unbearable shame. Still, pride refused to let him speak. Captain Thomas Reed noticed. Officer Monroe. Monroe didn't answer. You have something to say. His jaw tightened. The words refused to come. Before he could continue, Colonel Rebecca Lawson reached into a secure document case. She removed a single sealed folder. The cover bore only a federal classification stamp. She did not open it. Instead, she placed it gently on the desk. This file contains only the portions of Master Sergeant Ellison's record that I am authorized to acknowledge. Everyone watched in silence. Rebecca looked at Marcus. You spent 22 years making sure other men received the credit. Marcus said nothing. You never requested recognition. Still silence. She nodded respectfully. But today, as she turned slowly toward the room, the truth belongs to everyone who watched him be humiliated. Her hand rested on the sealed folder. She broke the security seal. The room leaned forward almost as one. The greatest secret of Marcus Ellison's life was finally about to be revealed. No one in the security office breathed as Colonel Rebecca Lawson slowly opened the classified folder. The room had been filled with arguments only minutes earlier. Now the only sound was the soft turning of heavy government documents. Rebecca looked at Marcus. You've spent your entire life avoiding this moment. Marcus lowered his eyes. I never wanted recognition. I know. She offered him a respectful nod before turning toward everyone else. But today isn't about recognition. Her voice echoed through the silent hallway. It's about restoring a man's dignity. She lifted the first document. This record has been partially declassified with authorization from United States Special Operations Command. Officer Travis Monroe swallowed hard. For the first time since entering the VA that morning, he wished he had never answered the call. Rebecca continued. Master Sergeant Marcus Ellison served 22 years in the United States Army. She paused. 14 of those years were spent assigned to America's most demanding special operations missions. No one interrupted. Now he received 3 silver stars. Gasps spread through the lobby. 2 bronze stars with valor. Frank Collins instinctively looked down at the medal Monroe had kicked across the floor. 4 purple hearts. Nurse Olivia covered her mouth. And numerous commendations that remain classified. Rachel Kim whispered toward her cameraman. Keep rolling. Brian Cooper nodded without taking his eye from the camera. Rebecca placed the first page on the desk. Those decorations are impressive. She looked around the room. But they are not why these men came. Jonathan Briggs quietly stepped beside her. May I? Rebecca nodded. Jonathan faced the growing crowd. I commanded soldiers for nearly 30 years. He slowly looked toward the line of former Delta operators. I've seen extraordinary courage. He turned toward Marcus, but I only met one man who repeatedly volunteered to stay behind. Silence. He never asked another soldier to take a risk he wasn't willing to take first. Another former's operator stepped forward. Daniel Reeves. His voice trembled slightly. I was 27. He smiled sadly. I thought I was invincible. Several men quietly laughed. So did we. Daniel continued. Our convoy was hit. He glanced toward Marcus. I couldn't move. He touched the scars running beneath his shirt. I told him to leave me. He swallowed. He ignored me. Daniel's eyes began to fill with tears. He carried me almost 2 miles under fire. No one spoke. A second veteran stepped forward. Michael Grant. I flew helicopters. He looked at Marcus. Our extraction failed. Michael shook his head slowly. I watched Marcus disappear into the smoke. He smiled. I honestly believed I'd never see him again. He paused. 37 minutes later, his voice cracked. He walked back carrying another wounded soldier. Then another. Then another. The hallway had become completely silent. Even reporters had stopped writing. One by one, the remaining operators stepped forward. Isaiah Turner, Robert Hayes, Eric Dawson. Some of them told long stories. They all repeated different versions of the same sentence. He came back. He refused to quit. He wouldn't leave us. He carried me. He saved my life. He stayed. Finally. Henry Wallace slowly rolled his wheelchair beside Marcus. The elderly veteran struggled to stand. Marcus immediately reached out. Henry squeezed his arm. No. He smiled weakly. This time. Let me stand for you. Marcus helped him carefully to his feet. Henry turned toward Officer Monroe. When you shove him onto that floor. His voice shook. You asked why he cared more about me than himself. Monroe couldn't answer. Henry continued. Because that's who he's been his entire life. A tear rolled down Henry's weathered face. I wasn't just the last man he carried out of that valley. He looked toward the crowd. I was the slowest. Quiet laughter mixed with tears. I kept telling him to save himself. Henry smiled at Marcus. You know what he said? Marcus closed his eyes. He remembered every word. Henry answered for him. Nobody gets left behind today. Several veterans quietly wiped away tears. Captain Thomas Reed slowly removed his reading glasses. David Brooks looked down at the floor. Even Officer Kevin Morales struggled to hide the emotion on his face. Rebecca Lawson carefully closed the classified folder. There is one final statement. She unfolded a separate page. It was written by a former commander of Joint Special Operations Command after Master Sergeant Ellison retired. She began reading. Leadership is often measured by rank. Character is measured by sacrifice. Master Sergeant Marcus Ellison repeatedly chose the lives of others over his own career, his own safety, and his own recognition. America owes him more than medals. It owes him gratitude. The hallway remained silent for several seconds. Then something unexpected happened. Without instruction, without ceremony. Jonathan Briggs slowly came to attention. He raised a crisp military salute toward Marcus. Daniel Reeves followed. Then Michael Grant, Isaiah Turner, Robert Hayes, Eric Dawson, one after another. Every former Delta operator stood at attention and saluted. The movement spread through the hallway. Frank Collins, despite his age, painfully straightened his back. Other veterans followed. Officer Kevin Morales quietly removed his cap once again. He didn't know military protocol, but he knew respect. Within moments. Nearly every veteran inside the VA stood. Marcus looked around the room in disbelief. His eyes became wet. Please. His voice barely escaped. You don't have to. Jonathan smiled. We know. He held the salute. We want to. Marcus finally broke. Not with loud sobs. Just one silent tear that slowly traced down his face. For decades he had hidden from praise. Today, he could no longer hide from gratitude. Across the room, everyone instinctively looked toward Officer Travis Monroe. He remained standing alone. No salute, no words. Only the crushing realization that he had forced a true American hero face down onto the floor and kicked aside the medal that barely represented everything Marcus had sacrificed. The salute remained frozen in the air. For nearly half a minute, no one lowered a hand. The lobby of the Houston VA Medical Center had become something far greater than a hospital waiting room. It had become a place where truth had finally outrun assumptions. Marcus Ellison slowly looked from one familiar face to another. Jonathan Briggs, Daniel Reeves, Michael Grant, Isaiah Turner, Robert Hayes, Eric Dawson, Henry Wallace. Men he had laughed with. Men he had mourned beside. Men he had once believed he would never see again. Marcus took one slow breath. "Thank you." His voice was barely above a whisper. "But I don't deserve all this." Jonathan Briggs smiled. "That's exactly why you do." A few quiet laughs broke through the emotion. For the first time that morning, the unbearable tension inside the building began to lift. Captain Thomas Reed stepped toward Officer Travis Monroe. "Officer." Monroe looked up. "Yes, sir." "Hand me your badge." The room became silent once again. Monroe hesitated. Reed's expression never changed. "That's not a request." Slowly, almost mechanically, Monroe unclipped the silver badge from his uniform and placed it into Reed's waiting hand. "Your firearm." Monroe removed it without a word. "Your department identification." Another pause. Then his identification card joined the badge. Captain Reed spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Effective immediately, Officer Travis Monroe is relieved of duty pending a formal internal affairs investigation into excessive force failure to assess the situation and conduct unbecoming a law enforcement officer. No applause followed. Marcus was grateful for that. Justice did not need celebration. It only needed to be carried out fairly. Monroe looked toward Marcus for the first time without anger. Only regret. His voice faltered. Marcus waited quietly. "I thought," Monroe stopped again. "I thought I was protecting someone." Marcus nodded. "I believe you." Monroe looked surprised. Marcus continued. "But protecting people starts with seeing them." Silence filled the room. "You never looked at me." Monroe lowered his head. "I only saw what I expected to see." Marcus answered gently. "And that's why this happened." The words carried no bitterness, only truth. Captain Reed placed a hand on Monroe's shoulder. "We'll finish the investigation." Monroe nodded weakly before walking out of the office. No one mocked him. No one followed him. His own conscience had become punishment enough. Meanwhile, Hospital Director David Brooks stepped forward carrying a microphone borrowed from the media team waiting outside. "I owe everyone here an apology." He faced Marcus first. "Mr. Ellison." Marcus quietly interrupted. "Marcus is fine." David smiled sadly. "Marcus." He took a deep breath. "You came here to help another veteran. We failed to help either of you." He turned toward the gathered veterans. "Beginning today, the Houston VA Medical Center will implement new emergency response procedures for veterans experiencing PTSD episodes." He continued. "Law enforcement responding inside this facility will receive mandatory training on combat trauma de-escalation and veteran crisis recognition." Several veterans nodded quietly. David wasn't finished. "We are also creating a volunteer transportation partnership named," he looked toward Marcus, "the Ellison Initiative." Marcus immediately shook his head. "Please don't." David smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." A few people laughed softly. "So we'll let the veterans vote on the name." The laughter grew warmer. Across the room, Rachel Kim approached Marcus. "For millions of people watching today." She hesitated. "What would you like them to remember?" Marcus looked around the crowded lobby. He noticed the Bronze Star Medal still resting carefully in Frank Collins's hands. Frank walked over and placed it back into Marcus's palm. Marcus brushed his thumb across the scratched metal before answering. I'd like them to remember Henry. Henry blinked. Me? Marcus smiled. People keep talking about what happened to me. He looked toward the elderly veteran. But I came here because he deserved medical care. He turned back to Rachel. If one veteran has to fear asking for help, he gently closed his fingers around the metal. Then all of us still have work to do. Rachel lowered her microphone. She realized no better ending could ever be written. Later that afternoon, after reporters had left and the crowds had finally disappeared, Marcus walked Henry toward the parking lot. Jonathan Briggs caught up with them. You sure you don't want to come to dinner? Marcus chuckled. You invited half the state. Jonathan grinned. 31 old Delta guys. Marcus laughed. You finally learned to count. The men around them laughed with him. For a brief moment, they were no longer decorated veterans, no longer commanders, no longer heroes. They were simply brothers. Henry climbed carefully into Marcus's old pickup truck. Jonathan watched the faded vehicle for a moment. You know, Marcus looked over. You saved our lives. Marcus smiled gently. You would have done the same. Jonathan answered without hesitation. No. Marcus frowned. No. Jonathan shook his head. We tried. He looked toward the old truck disappearing through the parking lot. You were the only one stubborn enough to keep going back. Marcus waved once through the driver's window before pulling away. The black SUVs gradually left the VA one by one. By sunset, the hospital looked exactly as it had the day before. The broken routine had been repaired, but every person who had witnessed that morning carried something home. Not the image of a man lying in handcuffs, but the image of dozens of soldiers silently standing behind someone who had spent his life standing in front of them. Sometimes the greatest heroes never ask to be recognized. Sometimes they spend decades quietly lifting others while asking for nothing in return. And sometimes justice begins the moment we choose to see the person before judging the appearance.
The strongest people are often the quietest, and true honor is measured by how we treat others when we know nothing about their story. If this journey moved, you share your thoughts in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories that remind us why dignity, compassion, and justice should never be optional.